60b, towards the bottom. Where's the question? Ibailu. Pesach sheshachtu b'shayim eisashana b'shini bailamahu. We've been learning that a korban Pesach has very strict laws when it's actually a korban Pesach, but the laws are much more lenient if it's not a korban, if it's shechted not on Erev Pesach. It's not on Erev Pesach, it turns into a shlamim, and then you have all of these leniencies that apply to a shlamim. Now, if I have a korban Pesach that I shecht not on Pesach, but I shecht it b'shini bailim, I shecht it for the intention of someone else other than the owner. Now, normally, that would invalidate the sacrifice. Would it invalidate, or it wouldn't work for the... So, it's still a korban Pesach. Still a korban Pesach. However, it should turn into naturally a korban shlamim. It should turn into a korban shlamim. And now it's shalei l'shem bailim. It's not for the owners. So the Gemara explains what's going on. Do we say, shinei bailim keshinei kodesh dami, umach shalei bailai? Do we say that the intention for the wrong owner is just like intention for a different sacrifice and it's kosher? If I intend it to be a shlamim, then it would become kosher. So if I intend for a different owner, it should also become kosher. In other words, we're just lowering the standard, lessening the stringencies of this sacrifice. That everything flies.
I mean, normally on Erev Pesach, when you have the group on the code, any time you can come and release it.
Actually not.
So why in this case?
Actually not. The kol dichvin is only when we don't have a korban Pesach. That's the hashat hacha. That's how the Rebbe explains. This year we're here and anyone wants to join can join. But next year we're going to be we'll have a korban Pesach. You won't be able to join. You have to sign up first. The menuya. That's how the Rebbe learns that. Yeah. So it's clear, you see, if it would be a regular shlamim, so I think the rule is by a shlamim. If you shecht it for the wrong owner, so, okay, it's a shlamim. If the guy dedicated a shlamim, and now Reuben dedicated a shlamim, and the kohen comes along and shechts it for Shimon. So, it should be kosher, just the guy has to bring another one. Now we're saying that it's a korban Pesach. We shechted it for the wrong owner. So we're saying, well, the korban Pesach that I shecht for a different sacrifice is kosher. So if I shecht it for a different owner, it should also be kosher. Amar Rav Papa. Rav Papa says, Amisal Shmaita Kamei Rava. Rav Papa is a student of Rava. He said, I said this in front of Rava, and I said the following. Hayel b'shinei kodesh paislei b'zmanei. If I shecht it on Erev Pesach itself, and I have intention for a different sacrifice, then it becomes puzzle, because a real korban Pesach in the correct time has very strict laws. And if on Erev Pesach I shecht the korban Pesach for a shlamim, it's puzzle. When it's not on Erev Pesach, the law is, the stringency is dropped. But on Erev Pesach itself, Shinei Kodesh, if I switch the type of sacrifice, it becomes puzzle. B'Shinei Bailam Pesach B'Zmanei. And if I shech the korban Pesach on Erev Pesach with the intention of, instead of for Reuven, I shech it for Shimon, it's also puzzle. Again, on Erev Pesach, the rules are very strict about a korban Pesach. So we extend it like this. When it comes to changing the sacrifice, that if it would have been Erev Pesach, it would be possible. Machshir lachas manai. But if it's not Erev Pesach, it's kosher. If I switch the type of sacrifice from a Pesach to a Shlomen, so Akshina Bailam Shapaisa Bismana Machshir lachas manai. So too, if I switch the owner, so it should also be kosher if it's not in the correct time. It's just a simple comparison. I have two things that are invalid on Erev Pesach, switching the type of sacrifice and switching the owner. Both of those are invalid on Erev Pesach. If it's not Erev Pesach, those two things, I only know about one of them. But if I switch the sacrifice, it's kosher. So probably if I switch the owner, it's also kosher. They seem to go hand in hand on Pesach. They should go hand in hand if it's not Erev Pesach. V'amar li, however, Rava said to me, this is Rav Papa talking, lie. That comparison is not perfect. Because what's the comparison? You're comparing switching the type of sacrifice to switching the owner. Im amrit b'shina kodesh, when it comes to switching the sacrifice, she came psulei begufay. V'yeshne bar ba'avedas. The Gemara attempts over here to say that if you're switching the sacrifice, you're affecting the actual carbon. And the Yeshne Ba'arba Vedas. And the thought of switching the sacrifice, that happens on any one of the four avodas. That means Shchita, Zrika, Kabbalah, Halacha, and Zrika. Any of those four activities that are done but with the slaughtering, receiving the blood, the walking in, and the sprinkling, those four, the laws of switching the sacrifice applies to them. In other words, if you have thoughts by any of those services, it's going to affect the sacrifice. The Yeshne Lachar Misa. And it also applies, yeah.
How did the people involved in the avoda know who they were doing it for?
Oh, the person would bring it up to them. At least by the shchita. Oh, you're asking about the Zrika. How did they know? That's a good question. How did they know who it was if it was just such a big, like a factory line? Okay, we're going to learn, and we mentioned it before, that when it comes to who's involved in the group, that's only by the shchita. So that would help. That would help. I didn't realize that was the complication, but we learned from Sukkim. Mm-hmm. That who's signed up to this group, that is only relevant for the shchita. That's what we're going to see soon. But the actual owner of the sacrifice, that the blood should be sprinkled for his intention, and I don't know how they kept track of that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so we have another point. We're on top of Samach Aleph. We have another point over here that if this sacrifice gets switched from one type of sacrifice to another, not necessarily does it have to do with the Korban Pesach. It could be any sacrifice, but it also applies to a Korban Pesach. That applies to any of the four avodas. So now we say, let's say the person dies and the son brings his father's sacrifice. So if when the son brings the sacrifice, they bring it for the wrong sacrifice, so it doesn't help, and he has to bring another one. It didn't get off. It's considered like it wasn't offered. The Yeshne B'tzibur K'biyachid. And this problem would apply to both a communal sacrifice, or a private sacrifice. If the sacrifice is slaughtered for the wrong sacrifice. Now let's go further. Talk about the owners. If you switch who's the correct owner here? It says the aim pisule begufay. Who the owner is doesn't affect the actual sacrifice. That's not pisul beguf. That doesn't change. Is this a chatas or is this a shlamim or something? That just says who the owner is outside. So it's not a pisul beguf. Notice what Rav is doing is Rav is saying that you can't compare the the way it works by changing the sacrifice to changing the owner. Because changing the owner, it doesn't affect the actual sacrifice. It doesn't apply to the 4 avodas. Maybe this is going to answer it. It only applies to the zrika. Only the one that's sprinkling the blood needs to know the owner. Where do we learn that from? We know that because the kapara, by a regular sacrifice, that the main point of it is not to eat, but the main point of it is a kapara, an atonement. So the kapara takes place by the zrika.
But I would think that that's because that's the completion of the act.
Right. Let's say the one that's shechting it shechts it for the wrong person. Apparently it's kosher. The switching of the type of sacrifice that gets affected by any of the 4. But switching of the owner, that would only be by the zrika itself. Again, this is a distinction between these two, which Rav is saying you can't do this comparison to say, if it worked over by the Korban Pesach, that's not on Erev Pesach, it's going to become kosher, because if you shecht it for a different sacrifice, it's kosher. So too, by a different owner, it should be kosher. Not necessarily. You can't compare the two. There's differences. Okay, be'ena lachar misa. If someone switches the owner, lachar misa, that means if there was a person that needed to bring a sacrifice or that dedicated a sacrifice and then he dies, and then the child brings the inheritors bring the sacrifice for him, but the intention was not for that person. It's still kosher. Not like if they brought it for a different sacrifice. If they brought it for a different sacrifice, it's not kosher because they didn't bring the sacrifice that was dedicated. But if they bring it for a different person, it's still kosher. Why? Because the person that they're supposed to bring it for isn't here anyway. And there's no such thing by a korban tzibur to switch the owner on a communal sacrifice, to say I'm bringing it for someone else. There's no such thing. Okay, that's Rava's comment back to Rav Papa that he made this comparison between switching the type of sacrifice to switching the owner, and the law should be the same. He says it's not true. There's a bunch of differences here. He says V'afagav the tarti lav dafka, tarti mia dafka. Even though 2 of these are not necessarily so, but 2 of them are necessarily so. The Gemara will explain which 2 is clear. Yeah, the commentaries discuss why you have to say it at all if it's not necessarily so. It says like this: the Maishna Shini Bailim, the Leavi Psuli Begufai, the Psuli Machshava Balma, the Psuli Machshava Balmahi, Shina Kedishnami Psuli Machshava Balma. First point, we said that when you switch the type of sacrifice, you're not actually switching the type of sacrifice. You're all switching it in your mind. It's not actually psulei begufay. It's not changing the animal in any way. Psul beguf is usually like a mum of some sort in the animal. It's not in the animal. It's, I had the intention that the sacrifice should be, instead of a chatas, should be a shlamim or a nasham or something. So you switch the type of sacrifice, but it's in your mind. Now, when you switch the owner, that's also in your mind. Both of those machshav, it's not really psul beguf. So we were saying, there's this huge difference between between switching the type of sacrifice to switching the owner. One is in the sacrifice, and one is just someone standing outside. So it turns out both of those are just taking place in the mind anyway. It's not actually in the sacrifice. So that means that both of these are similar, which lends to Rav Papa's svara that if it works for switching sacrifice, that it's kosher on a korban pesach. If you switch it to a shlamim, if it's not Erev Pesach, then it works, it's kosher. So too, if you switch the owner, it should be kosher. So this one distinction is actually not there. Visu, another one which isn't really there, another distinction which isn't there. This that you said, that if you switch the owner, if you have the intention for a different owner, after the original owner already passed away, so then we said that it doesn't matter because you anyways don't have the original owner there. The Rav Pinchas, we have one opinion that holds that it does make a difference. Makes a difference that if the inheritor brought the sacrifice for an owner, even though instead of the person that he's inheriting, if he brings it for someone else, according to Rav Pinchas, you have to go and bring another one, even though the person isn't there anyway, but that's what he holds. So according to him, that's exactly the same as if I would have switched the type of sacrifice. So again, I don't have a distinction between switching the type of sacrifice and switching the owner, which means that maybe we can apply the same laws. And if it's kosher by switching this type of sacrifice, also by switching the owner. So, however, Rava goes on and says, Tarti miya dafkaninu. However, two of these are specific. And what are those two? Tzibur kibiyachid, psul begufay. If it's a psul of switching the carbon, that applies to a tzibur. And if it applies to all the avodas or just to the zrika, those are clearly distinctions. So Elam Rava, rather Rava says, Pesach sheshachta b'shar yemais hashana b'shinei bailim. You shechta carbon Pesach the rest of the year, and you have intention for a different owner. Nasa k'mishein le bailim b'zmanei apostle. It's as if that you shechted it without the owner in the proper time, which means it still has the status of the carbon Pesach, which would make it possible. So basically, what comes out is that Rav Papa attempted to say that it should be kosher if you switch the owner, and Rava says back that no, even though it naturally turns into a shlamim, but you didn't actually change it into a shlamim, and if you switch the owner, it still has that status of the carbon Pesach. Valid. Yeah. Yeah, Taisus is discussing that the Gemara actually switched one nuance here as it concludes. And instead of saying Nasa Kamisha Shinei Bailam, it says Nasa Kamisha Ainlei Bailam. And that's a switch. The Rava switch, there's a slight nuance and the difference in his conclusion. Okay, let's see, there's a new Mishnah here, but this Mishnah we actually mentioned yesterday. Mishnah says, Shachtur Shleila Achlav. The Gemara is going to explain that what it means, but if the shechita was done on a carbon Pesach for people that aren't actually able to eat the carbon Pesach, why can't they eat it? Because they're older. They won't be able to eat a full kazayas of it. Either they're older or ill, right? What's the difference between someone that's healthy or sick? It's appetite. So this person can't eat the carbon Pesach, and the person that shechted the carbon Pesach had intention for him. So there's no one there that can eat it. Or the person that shechted it had intention for people that didn't actually sign up to this carbon. It has to be shechted lemnuya. We'll see in a moment. La'arelim, for people that were not circumcised, not because they're sinners, but because the brother passed away. Brothers passed away. And there was a concern to do a bris on them because the blood didn't clot because of hemophilia. And you know, the Gemara understood that it was a sex-linked genetic. So two sisters that had each children that were hemophilia also applies. They in the Gemara they understood that it carried through the mothers, not through the fathers. Is that correct? Okay, whatever it is. So ulatmeim, and for people that are impure and they're not able to have the Korban Pesach. Now, if the whole congregation was impure, that would be different, because then it's Tumah is Techuya B'tzibur. If everyone is Tameh, then you would bring it anyway. But if they're not, if it's just an individual, then he's supposed to wait for the Pesach Sheni. But if this sacrifice was shechted for people that are Tameh or for one person that's Tameh, then everything is possible. All of these, there was no one near that was able to eat it. Now the Mishnah goes on. Let's say some of the people here were not eligible, but some were eligible. Some were able to eat it, and some not. Some people were part of the group, and then there was people that weren't, non-members. They joined in. They don't invalidate it. We'll see in a moment. Some people died, and some were not. There happened to be that someone in the group happened to be Tameh. So that's kosher. That's still kosher. Shachat koydem chatzayis. Let's say it was shechted before noon. Before noon, that was the problem, right? You're supposed to shecht it bein arbayim. Then it's puzzle mishum shenemer bein arbayim. It's not the afternoon. Shachtu koydem latamid. It was supposed to be shechted after the Korban Tamid. We had a whole discussion when to shecht the Korban Tamid on Erev Pesach. So you're supposed to shecht the Korban Pesach after the Korban Tamid. Korban Tamid is supposed to be first. Let's say you didn't do that and you shechted it before the Korban Tamid. So it's kosher. What you should do in that case is that you should have someone stirring the blood so that the blood doesn't congeal, and you do the whole service of the Tamid. After the Tamid is completed, then you go and sprinkle the blood of the Korban Pesach, and that will be how you rectify the situation. Bimniz are kosher, but if you didn't do that and you actually just sprinkled the blood right away, it's still kosher because it was in the afternoon. We said you should do the one that says Ba'erev and Beina Arbayim, after the one that says just Beina Arbayim. Remember, we had those come over there. So, but nevertheless, that's not ma'akev. That's just l'chatil. Taner Rabbanan. Gemara quotes a brisa. Keitzad shleila eichlav. What's the case for people that aren't eligible to eat it? L'shem chayla or l'shem zaken. You shechted it for the intention of someone that's ill or someone that's old. Keitzad shleila mnuyav. What's an example of people that aren't part of the group? So nimno alav chaburazu v'shachto shem chabur acheres. If you joined in, you registered this group, but the shechita of the carbon was for a different group. Minani mili. Where do we know that this is the halacha? Taner Rabbanan was taught in a brisa b'michsas. This is yesterday's chumash. What is b'michsas? B'michsas nefashes techaisu ala seret. So, yeah, michsas means the amount. At least that's the way Rashi translates it yesterday. Michsas means according to the amount. Yesterday for the students, I was looking at the questions. We make questions for them to learn the Chumash, the questions in Rashi. So we asked, what is b'michsas? We had to give like multiple choice. They said maybe it means a garment. Maybe it means tax. Or what else? They had another one over there. Anyway, it means the amount. Okay. At least that's the first pshat in our Gemara. It has to be shechted for the amount of people that are registered. Korban Pesach needs to be shechted for those that are registered. That's where we learn this from. Maybe, okay, you shechted it for the people that weren't registered, but the sacrifice is still kosher. There's a double expression. And that double expression teaches us a kasav shana alav la'akev. The pasuk repeats it to tell me that if you didn't do that and you shechted it for people that weren't registered, then it's possible. If it's entirely for people that weren't registered. In Kachim, that's how it works. And when we learned Zvachim Menachos, so we learned that any time the pasuk repeats itself, that tells me that it's miyakev. It says it once, then it's just lachatchila. It says it a second time, that tells me that it's puzzle if you didn't do it correctly. Rebbe Yomer Lashon Sursihu. Rebbe says that this is Sursi. Now, Rashi tells me Sursi means Aramaic, but then he goes on to tell me lingo. The word Rashi uses.
It's the Aramaic lingo.
Aramaic lingo. Chachmi Umaskarin lingo. Linga Shurya. I don't know what that means. I don't know if the art scroll translates Linga Shurya. So anyway, he says it's an Aramaic expression. In Aramaic, michsas means to shech. Kais in Aramaic means to shech. Shech for me this sheet. Now, Rashi, what's happening here is that Rebbe is not actually arguing with the Tanakama that it needs to be shechted for those people that are joined in. It's just the question is, does michsas mean the amount of people, or does michsas mean to shecht it for the people that are joined in? So either way, it's the same halakha. Well, not liminoya. Yeah, do you have any comment on sursi? What sursi is? Okay. Lashon Sursi. Rebbe Yomer Lashon Sursi. No, it's the Gemara. Just check. Maybe it's associated with Surya. That's it.
Originates in Syria.
Very good. I've nothing got it. Okay.
What is it? What is it?
He was saying that Avram Nassim suggested that Sursi means that it comes from Syria. So Dr. Stein looked it up, that it says, yeah, it's a dialect of Aramaic that comes from Syria. Okay. We find that it's not valid for people that aren't registered. But how do you know it's also not valid for people that aren't able to eat it? Man, according to the people that can eat it, that's how you should shecht it. That's how you should count it. Now, in other words, you join into the group based on how many people that are going to be eating. So, based on that, iskish eichlen leminoyin. We compare the people that are able to eat to those that are registered, and just like when it's registered, it needs to be only for the registered people. At least some of the people need to be registered for it to be valid. So too, when it comes to able to eat, it needs to be people that are able to eat. Okay, we're on top of Samach Aleph 61b, and the Gemara starts off with a slightly complex concept here, which is a machlekes, turns out to be a machlekes, and it takes us all the way till tomorrow's discussing this, what's going on. And today we'll probably end off with a question. We'll have to complete it. So it goes like this. Shachtoi lemulin, if the shechita was done to feed the Karban Pesach, the people that had a circumcision and that were able to eat the Karban Pesach. Almanas sheyiskapru by arelim bezrika. But you had intention at the shechita that you're going to sprinkle the blood for other people that are not really part of this carbon because they're arelim, they're uncircumcised. So you did one service correctly, and at that service you had intention for the next service is going to be done not correctly. Rav Chisda Amar Pasal, Rabba Amar Kasher. Machlekes Rav Chisda and Rabba. Rav Chisda says it's Pasal, Rabba says it's kosher. Rav Chisda Amar Pasal, Rav Chisda says that it's not valid. He says Yesh Machshavas Arelim Bizrika. He says that because you intended by the zrika, by the sprinkling of the blood, for people that are not part of this arelim, they're uncircumcised, they shouldn't be part of the sacrifice. So you invalidated the sacrifice. Makes sense. Rabba Makasher, Ein Machshavas Arelim Bizrika. By the zrika, there's no intention of who's part of this sacrifice. And because it's a carbon pesach, and it's there for eating, not for kapara. So you had intention that this is going to be for a for people that aren't part of this because they're uncircumcised. The same thing would apply if they're not registered. But that was your intention. The zrika has nothing to do with this. We only have this by the shechita. As we mentioned before, that the shechita is the one that makes the difference, right? In Michtas, we said the people need to be registered. That we said was by the shechita. Yeah, at least according to Rebbe, that was clear because he pointed out the Michtas means shechita. Okay. Let's see the explanation here. Amar Rabba. Rabba says, Mina Aminallah. How do you know this? How do I know what I'm saying? That the whole issue of having intention for the people is only by the shechita, not by the zrika, is because the Tanya, I have a brisa. It says, Yochal Yifsal b'nei Chabura habayim imay. Maybe if there's one oral in the group, one person that's uncircumcised in the group, the whole thing is invalid. Maybe I should say that. Vidinu, and it could be even logical. Hayel va'arla peiseles v'tuma peiseles. An oral, if someone is uncircumcised, then the sacrifice is not valid. Not if he's in the group, that we don't know yet. But if it's only for someone that's oral, if it's only for a group of arelim, the sacrifice is not valid. And also tuma peiseles. And also if it's shechted only for people that are tummy, the sacrifice is not valid. Now we go like this. When it came to the impurity, if there's one person that's tummy, we don't say that the whole sacrifice is invalid. We say the sacrifice is for everyone else. So the same thing we should say by arla, that if there's one person that wasn't circumcised, we don't say that the whole sacrifice is invalid. We say that it's for everyone else and it's valid. Now, the Gemara is going to need to explain why it knew this so clearly by Tuma, and it didn't know it the same way for Arla. Somehow there's a piece of information here that the Gemara knows that it didn't tell it to us yet. But doesn't invalidate the whole sacrifice. If there's only one person Tuma, you have another 5 that are tar. It's going to be perfect. It's going to be fine. So too, if that's how it works by Tuma, that's how it's going to work for Arla as well. That's the first thought here. Or maybe go away from this, and we say it differently. I know that if there's only arelim here, only uncircumcised people, or if a person has the wrong thoughts by the sacrifice, he has thoughts to sprinkle the blood after the correct time. Zman. So both of those cases are invalid. Everyone is uncircumcised, or the thoughts are chutz lismana. It's puzzle. Now the Gemara makes the comparison. Ma'azman asaba miktasman kecholzman. Let's say his thoughts were, I'm only gonna eat or sprinkle a kazayas I'm only gonna eat a kazayas of the animal after the allotted time, a kazayas of the sacrifice. So that's also considered chutzlas mani. It's also considered pigel, right? Chutzlas mani. You have intention for the wrong time, out of the allotted time. That's considered pigel, and it doesn't have to be the whole sacrifice. Even a small amount of it is also considered pigel. So if by zman, when it comes to the psul of zman, of time, that we say that even a little bit of this sacrifice will invalidate the whole sacrifice, we should say the same thing by someone that's uncircumcised. Even one person that's uncircumcised will invalidate the whole sacrifice. Basically, what we're doing over here is we have three things. We have tumah, impurity, which invalidates the sacrifice if the people are tamei. We have arla, which invalidates the sacrifice if people aren't circumcised. And then we have chutzlas mani, if the intention is for the wrong time. Now, what we understood was like this, that if there's an individual that's tamei, the sacrifice is still kosher as long as the rest of the people are tahar. And if there's chutzlas mani, even if there's a little bit that's chutzlas mani, the whole sacrifice is invalid, even though the rest was done correctly. Now I have arla in the center. Do I compare arla, uncircumcised individual in the group, to tumah, and therefore it should be acceptable because by tumah, just one person in the group was tamei, the sacrifice is still valid for the rest of the people? Or do I compare it to chutzlas mani? And on chutzlas mani side, if even one kazayas is chutzlas mani, the whole sacrifice becomes pigel. So too, one person that's an aral, the whole sacrifice will become invalid. So I have arla in the middle, and if I compare him to tumah, then it's going to be valid. If I compare it to chutzlas mani, it's going to be invalid. Which way do I go? The Gemara says like this: Nir l'mi daima. Let's see to which one it's more comparable to. Danin davar she'in nayig b'chol hazvachim, midavar she'in nayig b'chol hazvachim. We can compare something that doesn't apply to all sacrifices. That is arla. Arla doesn't apply to all sacrifices. Now, there's a little catch here. It's not 100% like straight across. The way it works is like this: if someone wasn't circumcised, but he wants to send the carbon to the Beis Hamikdash, there's no problem. Send it with someone else. Yeah, even a guy can send the sacrifice. There's no problem with that. If someone is tamei and he wants to send the carbon to the Beis Hamikdash, go ahead, send it with someone else. I mean, you're not going to be allowed to eat from it, whatever. Now, an oral is also not supposed to eat from any carbon, but he can send the carbon. Okay, so we say like this: Arla doesn't apply to all sacrifices. The exception of what we were talking about now isn't what we were talking about a minute ago. Is not what we're talking about now. A minute ago, we were saying that someone that's uncircumcised cannot join into the sacrifice as part of to register on the sacrifice or to send the sacrifice. He can't send the carbon pesa. An Earl that can't send the carbon pesa. That's a specific din by carbon pesa. However, any other sacrifice, yeah, it's no problem. Go send the shlamim or whatever. An Oila, tapas. He's an Earl. It's no problem. And the same with tumah. Can send the sacrifice. Okay. So the Gemara says, well, that's a comparison arla to tumah. So let's compare arla to tumah. Obviously, what comes out of that is that if there's one aral in the group by the carbon pesa, so very similar to tumah. One tamei person in the group, the rest of the sacrifice is kosher. So let's compare something that doesn't apply to all other sacrifices, which is arla, to tumah, which doesn't apply to all other sacrifices. And don't mix in zman. Don't tell me that, well, compare it to zman, to time, out of the allotted time. Why? That's different. That applies to all sacrifices. Arla doesn't apply to all sacrifices. Or maybe, let's do it differently. Donin davar shloi huter michlale, mi davar shloi michlale. 1 second. Tuma sometimes becomes permissible. If everyone is tamei, you're allowed to bring the carbon betuma. If the whole congregation is tamei. Arla, if everyone is arelim, it doesn't say that you're allowed to bring a sacrifice. It doesn't say that. And so too Zman. You don't say there's some sort of leniency about chutz l'zmanai. You never have that. It's always pigel. It's always apostle, the carbon. So now, if you look at it like that, now Arla is more similar to Zman. Let's compare Arla to Zman. Uncircumcised, the invalidity of one person in the group being uncircumcised would invalidate the whole group, just like one kazayas of chutz l'zmanai would invalidate the whole sacrifice. And don't tell me that Tuma is more comparable here. No, Tuma is so different because Tuma has a leniency that if everyone is Tameh, then the sacrifice is acceptable. So the Gemara says, I don't know who to compare this to. This is a brisa that we're quoting. Do I compare it to Tuma? Do I compare it to Chutz l'zmanai? Talmud Loimar Zeis. So therefore the pasuk says Zeis. My Zeis. What is Zeis? What are you saying, Zeis? It says Zeis chukas Pesach. What do I learn from that? Ilema the kulei arla pasla miksasa loi pasla. Maybe what it means is like this. Zeis is an exception. This is pasul. When do we say that the carbon Pesach is pasul when there's people there that are uncircumcised? Maybe it means like this. That's only if everyone there is uncircumcised. Zeis. But that's only when it's pasul. But if it's not everyone that's uncircumcised, there's only an individual there that's uncircumcised. The rest of the group is circumcised. And that's, so Zeis tells me that it's kosher. If that's what Zeis is teaching me, I have a problem. We have a pasuk that says, Kol oral la yechal bay. Anyone that's uncircumcised shouldn't eat from the sacrifice. We say anyone, we actually mean kol oral. We mean if everyone, if all in the group is uncircumcised, then it's invalid. That means that if some of them are circumcised, the Korban Pesach is valid. See, you're learning Zeis to tell me something that I already know from Kol Oral, that it needs to be the whole group to be apostle. Elalav, it must be different. Hachiktani, this is what it means. Talmud Leimer v'Chol Oral. When it says v'Kol Oral, Kula Orla Pasla, Miktsasa Loi Pasla. That Kol Oral tells me you're right. If the whole group is uncircumcised, it's invalid. If part of the group is uncircumcised and the rest are circumcised, it is valid. We're in the middle of a sentence here. Maybe you would say that the same thing applies by the zrika, which means that if I intend to sprinkle the blood for people that are arelim, the kula arlamia pasla, only if I intend to sprinkle it for everyone that's arelim. So that would be pasal, Talmud Zeis. It says no. Zeis. Only this. What does that mean? B'shchitu de kula arlamia pasla, v'zrika filu kula arla nami like pasla. By shchit, the Zeis is telling me that what invalidates a sacrifice when it comes to uncircumcised people is only by the shchita, not by the zrika. Now, the truth is that uncircumcised people in the sacrifice is only if it's entirely, the whole group is uncircumcised. But if there's just one individual, it's fine. That we learned from Kol Oral. Comes along the Zeis to tell me that that invalidation is only by the shchita, but not by the zrika. This was Rabba's long explanation to tell me that if you shechted it for people that are circumcised, but you had intention to sprinkle the blood for people that aren't circumcised, sprinkling of the blood has nothing to do with uncircumcised, not uncircumcised, has nothing, that doesn't invalidate the sacrifice. And his expression of ein machsheves arelim bezrika is from this Gemara because it says Zeis. Yeah. So,
It's hard for me to understand the logic here of the last argument. The issue that is being discussed here is whether a person who is part of a group and is possible for this purpose invalidates the whole group.
Right.
Well, if every single person in the group is individually possible, there's nothing to talk about.
Yeah.
We don't need a pasuk or anything for that.
Right.
The only issue comes up when, what do you do when 1 out of 40 is
Right.
possible? So I'm missing the logic here.
So what's happening here is like this.
We're missing the logic. We're missing it.
You're shechting for the group, all right? You're shechting for a certain group of people. If there's one person in that group that's not valid, we've determined that the sacrifice is still valid based on the pasuk, the kol oral. It needs to be everyone is invalid. If that's going to be fine. If one person is in, however, if the entire group was not valid, so in the shechita was done for this entire group, so then the sacrifice is not valid. Kol oral, it's not valid. Let's say you then go over, not to the shechita, but you go to the zrika. And the zrika is done for an entire group that's not valid. So Rabbah holds that the zrika has nothing to do with this. That's not part of this. That's not part of this equation. Not part of the argument. That wasn't. That doesn't affect the sacrifice. It's only the shechita. The intention of who's in the group is only by the shechita. That's what Zeiss tells me.
Yeah. Do you know how the halakha ends up on this?
Oh, I'm not sure.
The reason I'm asking is, when it comes to the halakhas of Edut, if you put together a group, that group lives or dies, it's qualified or unqualified on the basis of one person in a group of witnesses can disqualify the entire group.
Right.
If they're put together as a group, which is what happens with the carbon Pesach, they're purposely put together.
Yeah, it's an interesting comparison. What was it, Rabbi Akiva in Gemara Makkos? Ma yaser shnei achim shreich et hargas enefesh. What if two brothers are there? Yeah. Okay. Now the Gemara challenges this, what we just said. We seem to have some clarity here on Rabbah, that there's a difference between if everyone in the group is invalid or if one person in the group is invalid, and that difference is only by the shechita. But by the zrika, nothing matters. If you'll say, why is there a leniency by zrika? The answer is, because there's no thoughts of who's eating here by the zrika. This is circular logic. Why? If you'll say, what's the problem? Why is there a leniency by zrika? The answer is because there's no problem of who's in the group by zrika. Okay, the Mefarshim discuss how the Gemara can do that here, to answer you with the question by repeating the question. Okay, but Rav Chisda, what does Rav Chisda do? Rav Chisda says that there's a problem by the zrika. He says like this. In other words, by the zrika, if they thought by the sprinkling of the blood that there's someone that's tamei, that everyone is tamei, it's not valid. I'm going to finish because I don't want to stop him. He says, Adrab, on the contrary, Lidach goes exactly the opposite. Talmud Laimar v'chol aral, the pasuk says v'chol aral, kula arla pasla miktsasa loy pasla. Only if everyone is invalid is the sacrifice invalid. Abel zrika, but when it comes to sprinkling of the blood, afila miktsasa nami pasla. Even when it comes to the shechita, the entire group needs to be invalid. But by the zrika, it says Zois. Zrika is different. That's what we learned the last time, according to Rab also. But what's different about zrika? Even if there's an individual there, it's already puzzled. Maybe say the other way. Maybe say that it needs to be exactly the same. Talmud Leimer Zois. Pasuk says Zois. No, zrika is different than shechita. Shechita the miktsas loy pasal, but zrika feel miktsas pasal. Zrika is more strict. The zrika. Why are you going to say? Where do you get it from that zrika is more strict? Mikva pigol ela bezrika. Rav Chisda says that in order for a sacrifice to become pigol, it cannot have any other invalidation. In other words, if you have thoughts that you're going to, when you shecht it, you have thoughts that you're going to sprinkle the blood or eat it after the allotted time, pigel. But then later on in the sacrifice, you have thoughts that you're going to eat it out of the wrong place, out of the plate, out of the area that you're allowed to eat it. So you've now added another disqualification to the sacrifice. So instead of becoming pigel, it just becomes a carbon that's possible. So the only time that something could become pigel is at the zrika, which is the end of the sacrifice, and everything else was done either correctly or totally pigel. So then it becomes pigel. So since zrika has that stringency that it makes something pigel, so zrika is always stricter. That's what it says. Maskefler.
Zrika sounds very similar to Pastam, we need that one of those things like such.
So Maskefler Ravashi. Ravashi has a question. All of this is based on kol oral, means that everyone in the group needs to be oral. How do you know that it means all? Dilma hay v'chol oral mashma kol dehu orla. Maybe kol oral means anyone. You see, when you say all, does all mean every or any? All members come inside. I mean, everyone has to come inside, or anyone can, right? What is kol? Kol means every. That means all, or does it mean anyone? Maybe kol oral means anyone that's there is going to invalidate it. So, kasav rachman azais, the adik kula oral leipasla leishna b'schita v'leishna b'zrika. His question is, Ravashi's question is, how do you know that it means that only if everyone is an oral is it invalid? Maybe what it means is like this. Maybe anyone that's an oral would invalidate it. And then comes along the Zeiss to tell me that we need to have everyone there, both by Zrika and by Shchita. It needs to be everyone invalid by Zrika and Shchita, which messes up the logic of Rav Chisda and Rabbah. Okay, let's leave it over here.